All right, hello everybody. I said I was going to see if I could put together some kind of extra video today for some, not this week, I mean, for something. And well, I've got something that I don't think is a completely fleshed out thought here, but I think I'm actually bumping into something that might be useful or interesting. So let me just get this out there, and maybe you can see if you can come up with some way to apply it, or to extend it, I guess is more appropriate terminology. So I am currently reading this. This is called Social Justice and the Indian Rope Trick. It is a collection of essays by Anthony de Jasay. He's a libertarian philosopher. He died a couple of years ago. He he actually pushes back against the constant use of the term rights in libertarian, what would you call it, like dialogue or rhetoric, on the basis that the that the use of that terminology is inherently uh, inherently promotes a sense of thinking that that has a tendency to decrease rights or decrease freedom, as a consequence of what you end up defending in arguments, basically. So that's kind of what he's known for. He's known for trying to formulate a libertarian system based on torts instead of a reference to rights. So there's no right to free speech according to Jasay, but what you can do is you can that silencing someone on their own property is a tort. For instance, it's a trespass and assault. You've prevented someone on their own property using their own stuff from saying something, and in order to do that, you need to encroach on their property and stop them physically, for instance. So, and I'm oversimplifying, but that's kind of what Jasay is known for. Is this reliance, or this attempt to kind of divorce the rhetoric of liberty from the term rights? And I'm not going to try to defend that necessarily this time, but what I am going to do is talk about a portion of one of these essays that is called the presumption of liberty, I believe, or just presumption of liberty. So, by the way, de Jasay is incredibly opaque as a writer. He's worse than Hayek. So, this has been a bit of. I mean, it's interesting, but it's definitely an uphill battle to get through some of these sentences and paragraphs. With that said, one of the things he talks about in a few places in this book, but in this section in particular, is the presumption of liberty. And he discusses it as a question of where the burden of proof should lie. That to argue against that to argue that um, a particular action is forbidden is something where the burden of proof cannot logically lie on the person saying it is free, because there's basically an unlimited number of potential reasons why it might not be free. And if the burden of proof lies on the person, that leads to kind of like a worldwide paralysis, basically. That if someone actually has a good reason why a certain action should be forbidden, should be prohibited, that they can put forth that reason, and it is possible to determine whether that reason is correct and whether that reason applies or not, whereas it's impossible to prove a negative. To give examples, he says, you have committed a crime is unfalsifiable but verifiable. For instance, if I say you have committed a crime, I can't prove that I have not committed a crime. That requires proving a negative, right? Which is a difficult proposition in formal logic. However, if someone says you have committed a crime and then they provide evidence of that crime and evidence that it is against a particular law or something like that, then you can verify that someone has committed a crime. So to talk about what de Jasay is getting in here, Jasay is worried that people say that the presumption of liberty depends on a love of liberty or evaluation of liberty. But he says, no, it's not actually true that you have to love liberty in order to accept a presumption of liberty. To quote, "The actor who wishes to perform it contends that it is free, whereas challengers contend that it is not. Propositions that have descriptive meaning are either verifiable or falsifiable, or sometimes both. Take the proposition that the act is not free, given by a challenger. There may be indefinitely many potential reasons for believing this notion, having mostly to do with the meanings of rules and with putative harms to various interests. The actor can falsify, or the would-be actor can falsify some of them by showing they are groundless or of insufficient force. But as he falsifies some, others can always be advanced because such reasons are numberless. Therefore, the actor cannot bear the burden of proof, and in logic, it would be nonsensical to place it on him. The challenger, however, is in an altogether different, we may say, asymmetrical position. Any specific reason against the act in question that he thinks is sufficient can be verified by argument and evidence bearing on that reason, etc., etc., etc. So, this sounds, once you get through the rather opaque language, this sounds good. And, you might even say it sounds kind of obvious, but we end up arguing, we end up making these arguments that a certain act should be free often. Whereas if we go back to this kind of logical framework, we understand that it's, that the number of possible reasons why an act could be forbidden are numberless and therefore cannot be falsified. So, the thing that I kind of drew from this is something interesting, something complementary even, where for people, regular people, the presumption of freedom is logically required, according to Jasay. You simply don't have the ability to prove the negative, that there is no rule that forbids this action, right? You can prove that a particular rule forbids this action, but you can't prove no rule that exists forbids this action, or that no combination of interests forbids this action. From a complementary perspective, what this actually means is that attempts to justify or promote scope creep in government, in contracts, is an illegitimizing force. That in order for a government to be legitimate, it must take the opposite, or it must take the complementary position that it only has the powers with which it has been given by way of contract, whether that contract be a nebulous social contract or an actual real contract. In fact, it also tells us that any legitimate expansion of power of a government, must flow from the government to the people upon which it is going to be enforced, and back as a question, and then the people must return with a yes or no, and the government has to accept the individual responses of the people. Otherwise, what it is effectively doing is saying, our contract with you says this, and unless they they need to come up with they need to come up with a reason why it isn't, rather than simply showing the contract saying that it is. To give a concrete example, imagine that a man enters into a contract with someone. He's a farmer. He enters into a contract with a seed seller and says, well, I will, you will supply me with X pounds of seed in, say, March, right? March or April. And I will provide you with, X bushels of the appropriate crop in October, or the, effective market value of them as of a certain particular time. This is, a contract. It would also have like an exit, an exit clause, like, if the farmer chooses to exit the contract, I must offer up the, a particular value's worth of crops or the appropriate money equivalent to the seed giver in order to get out of this contract. Basically, the contract starts with the seed seller providing the seeds. And so this person, the seed seller, is already in debt or in the negative at the start of the contract. So the exit terms of the contract have to be that the farmer makes the seed seller whole. And there might be a clause that says, well, if the seed seller, needs to, he can demand a certain amount of money at a certain time under a certain set of conditions, kind of thing. You could make it really complicated, but if we just go with the really simple version of it, right? We have this contract that goes from March to October, and it involves seeds transferring to the farmer in March, and it involves, either crops or money transferring over to the seed seller in October. Now, it would make no sense for the seed seller to say that that contract also gives him the power to determine where the farmer purchases water, for instance, or where the farmer purchases fertilizer, or how much fertilizer the farmer uses. In order for the contract to be a legitimate contract, to be interpreted literally, we must assume that any things that either party of the contract wants to enforce must be found in the contract. Again, as we saw, we could make the contract very, very long, and so it would become very difficult, if not impossible, to prove that a certain thing does not exist in the contract. But it does make sense to put the burden of proof on the person who wants to change the terms or change the actions or, forbid or permit or enforce a particular action, to say, here in the contract it says A, B, C, D, therefore that is, what's going to happen. So, based on this kind of logical argument from Jasay about who must bear the burden of proof for the legality or permissibility of any particular action, we gather by complement that in order for a contract or for the enforcement of a contract to be legitimate, that it must act from the complementary logical perspective, that something that to enforce or require or promote a certain particular type of action, that it must be found within that contract that such a requirement exists. The opposite conclusion is boundless, because someone can always say, well, you didn't look through the whole contract, which is at the point where it's a very simple contract, you could kind of go both ways. But as contracts get more complicated, as the terms become more nuanced, it becomes more difficult to place the burden of proof on the person to prove that this isn't in the contract. So, I don't know. This is kind of just something that's been percolating around in my head, that in order for... So one of the things I've been doing, reading Locke, reading to Jasay, thinking about voluntary styles of government, is to question and try to understand whether voluntary government, whether government with a similar form to what we see today could be considered legitimate, and what conditions must occur or must be changed in order for legitimacy to be for it to be voluntary, right? And so, I've been talking a lot about secession, right? Where if your consent to an organization goes beyond changes in the organization that might cause it to become negative, deleterious to you, then that really isn't consent, because what you're saying is, well, I agreed to, let's say, the Constitution, but I disagree with the interpretation of the Constitution that provides infinite war power to the executive, right? It would be entirely reasonable to accept certain terms of a contract, but once the contract expands, scope creep, it becomes, that contract which once was beneficial to you is no longer beneficial to you, and therefore your consent must be updated, right? So secession fixes this, right? In the sense that if secession is permitted, if there are terms by which someone can leave a state contract, right, then that means that by inference, the people who remain in it at least are relatively, if not informed about, at least consent to what it is doing. Because if they did not consent, if they believed that the government was acting contrary to their advantage in total, right? Then they would leave their contract, just as someone might decide that a Netflix subscription is no longer of the value to them that they get out of it, right? And that's how normal contracts are supposed to work between a free person and another free person or organization. So what I'm basically getting at here is that it seems to me that we have to err on the side of that if we don't, as a matter of course, rely on the most restrictive readings of state contracts or contracts in general, that we are ourselves illegitimizing the contract by basically allowing ourselves to read into it things that aren't in it. Basically, if and when the government tries to push, scope creep in its social contract with the people, that in itself is an illegitimizing act. That, so far as Hamilton was in the government when he suggested expansions of its power, the changing of the meaning of the term necessary to mean convenient in the Constitution, he was himself a force illegitimizing the government, as it were, turning it from what was, at least hypothetically, a voluntarily joined government into a coercive state. So I'm not going to pretend that this is the last word here, but this is the thought that's been kind of kicking around in my head for a while, and reading Jasay kind of helped me put better words to it, I guess. So that's what I've got for you guys for today. Something just kind of short and philosophical. What's going on right now, or what's going on in the near future? I'm going to be continuing with my work on Locke's Second Treatise. I actually started reading this book. This is Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and I've never actually read it in its entirety. I've read about it. I've read, for instance, the extremely famous Parable of the Slave that is in this book. I think I've read about Nozick. I've read some of his arguments, kind of by proxy, in other writings, but I haven't ever actually read the book itself. And so I sat down and I started reading a little bit of this the other day, and I have to say, it is very readable, very not simple, but very it flows very well. The arguments are explained in fairly understandable language. And it doesn't seem to have the opaqueness problem that Jasay or Hayek often have. So I have to say that I am enjoying this a lot, at least what I've read of it so far, which isn't much, but we'll see how it goes. The other thing that I just got was this big boy. This is Provoked by Scott Horton. It is the book How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. I've read the first chapter, which is about 34 pages, 33 or 34 pages, about the George H.W. Bush era. This one is looking to be very solid. Not only does it have a lot of detailed information, it also has a lot of footnotes, which means that you can actually get information out of this that could convince someone who is, not on our side already. So that's kind of where I'm at with reading right now. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, after I finish Locke, what do I do next? I'm thinking there's a couple of possibilities. There's some possibilities such as going on kind of in the same direction, like maybe go through Montesquieu or something like that. But I was thinking that it might be fun to do something a little bit more irreverent as well. And so I'm questioning whether it might be fun to do something like go through and kind of pick at Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread or something like that. So I don't know. Just kind of a little bit of inside baseball here of what kinds of things I'm reading, what kinds of things I'm thinking about making videos on in the near future. So I don't know. If you have any books that you would like me to take a look at, feel free to mention something in the comments or something like that. But as of right now, I'm going to be finishing up Locke and then moving on to something else, but I don't know exactly what yet. And hopefully I'll have some time to do more short videos on non-book topics as well. I'm trying to make more time for that. I finished draft number 7 of my first novel. and it's getting there. So anyway, that's all I've got for you for today. We'll have another look at Locke next week, which will be Chapter 16 of Conquest. And yeah, I might have some more ideas for short non-Locke videos as well, which I'll try to find time to record. So with that, I'll say thanks for watching, thanks for listening. If you enjoy the videos I'm doing, if you enjoy my kind of, unique look at libertarian philosophy, and you want to support the channel, you know what to do. It's Friday, so I hope you have a good weekend. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.